Hi, this is StrategyCast, where smart marketers and bold business thinkers share the plays behind brand breakthroughs. I'm Lori Jones, President and CEO of Avasec Communications. There is quiet tension inside every marketing team. You start with real customer insight, but as campaigns move through reviews, approvals, and edits, that outside perspective slowly gets replaced by internal thinking. The result is messaging that feels safe, but often fails to resonate, convert, and drive revenue. Today, we're talking about how to stop that from happening. You'll learn how to keep the buyer present from the first brief to final execution, how to pressure test messaging before it goes live, and how to build campaigns that actually connect, shorten sales cycles, and perform in market. Our guest today is Matt Wilkinson. He has spent significant time analyzing how marketing teams lose the buyer during execution and how to structurally fix that problem with what he calls synthetic customers.
A competitive edge starts with strategy, and strategy starts with knowing how to develop one. StrategyCast is a leading marketing podcast that serves up strategic insights, trends, and tips to help separate your business from the pack. Tune in weekly as host Lori Jones interviews bold marketing leaders who have priceless wisdom and are willing to share. Each episode explores cutting-edge approaches that have proven instrumental in transforming brands into industry trailblazers.
Welcome to the show, Matt.
Hi, thank you for having me.
I tell you, I am so excited to dive into this. Never once have we talked about synthetic customers on this show. Let's kick things off here. Tell us a little bit about yourself and the journey that you've been on and what led you ultimately to this aha moment.
Well, I started my career as a chemist, as a synthetic chemist, so it's probably no surprise that I end up making synthetic customers. I wound my way through journalism and into marketing and communications via an MBA, and spent most of my time for the last 13, 14 years working with companies in the life sciences and tech world, really sort of helping them with marketing strategy all the way through to execution. And one of the big things that came across my desk early on was Joe Pulizzi's Epic Content Marketing, where in there he has a big deep dive in how to use personas to really make sure that you keep an eye on what the customer needs and wants from you in your communications. And so ever since then, I've been really, really obsessed with making sure that we deliver great customer experience through content. And one of the things that I noticed with AI pretty early on was that you could use AI to turn those persona documents into something you could actually talk to. And so that's where my whole obsession with synthetic customers originated.
I love it. So let's dive into the persona problem everyone recognizes. You describe a problem that almost every marketer has experienced. Can you walk us through what typically happens to buyer insight from research to final campaign?
Yes, love to. So I've worked on so many projects where, you go off and you do a stupendous piece of research and you capture all this great insight and you capture the highlights in a presentation that then gets presented internally. Some of those insights get turned into personas with some questions that you ask, the questions that they want answering, the language that they use, their needs and wants, and you sort of capture this. And of course, it's really hard for us as marketers to step into other people's shoes. It's a bit like asking somebody that takes a size 12 shoe to walk a mile in somebody that wears a size 5 shoe. You can do it, but it's really painful. And the mental gymnastics to try and balance that as you go through creating content is hard. And then if you ask everybody that's involved in that process to perform those same mental gymnastics, everybody has a different way of fitting into those shoes. And it's really, really hard. And that's where you sort of lose the voice of the buyer through the process.
So why does it fail so often through process?
Well, I think there's a couple of reasons. One is because the mental gymnastics is so tough. The other is an idea that I'd like to call organizational gravity, where there is a sense that the organization has a safe space in which it operates. It has the words that have always been used, the words that are used internally. And that pulls the messaging away from the customer and into, inwards towards what the organization is comfortable with. And very often those are two separate bits of language. And that's where you sort of pull that messaging back in. And particularly as you go through different editors, different, legal reviews, that gets pulled further and further away from the customer.
Quite often in Avocet, when we're working on similar strategic programs, I'm always reminding the team and the client, customer first, client first, people first. We're talking about internal, how we do it, what we do. We've really got to resonate and transition that to why someone should care, which really helps. But, even with very professional marketers, that reminder is still needed from time to time.
Absolutely. The number of times I've needed to remind people to look at the persona documents, the questions are all in there, the information's there, or it's in the strategy document. Because after a while, we think we've learned it. We get a bit lazy in sort of thinking that we've already understood it. I've fallen guilty to that myself. The beauty is that with a synthetic customer, it's almost easier and lazier to actually ask them than it is to remember to do this. Yeah, how would this respond? How would our different persona respond to this messaging? Once it becomes part of that process and part of the approval process, you can start thinking, well, actually, we need to say something along here. We need to add this line in. How's my persona going to react if we do this? Where should we put it in the messaging? How should we word it? That becomes really easy to do.
So let's define that very clearly. What specifically is a synthetic customer?
So a synthetic customer is essentially an AI representation of your customer. There's initial research was done by folks at Stanford, Harvard, and a few other universities, really looking at how can you ask a large language model to represent a customer. And that's all well and good. And you'll probably have seen people talking about, asking AIs to represent your customer, hey, act as whatever role. And it does a pretty good job of acting as, that role. But that doesn't represent any of your, the insight that you've already created through your voice of customer. And so what I like to do is to sort of create grounded synthetic customers where you're grounding them in all of that research. So it's all of your, interview transcripts. And it doesn't have to be just the last few that you've done. That can go back over time as well. Right. So if you've got time and you've been repeating the process, you can get sort of temporal ideas of how things have changed over the years for your persona as well. That adds a really interesting wrinkle to this. But you create this knowledge base essentially that you can then turn into, add into the back end of essentially as context for the large language model.
Yeah, I love that. How do you believe that it's fundamentally different between an ICP and persona?
So I've always defined an ICP as your ideal customer profile. And, in the B2B world, your customer is the company. So the ICP is the company. And then within the company, you have a number of people that you're going to try to sell to, a buying group. And those buying groups are, according to Gartner, anywhere between 7 and 12 people in size. And sometimes, since COVID, the size of those buying groups has increased even further. So that can mean up to 20 people are getting involved in, making buying decisions. That means that actually we've got more and more people we need to influence. It means our messaging needs to resonate even better than it ever did before. And it also means that we've got a bigger problem with more and more buying decisions actually leading to a no decision at all. So we really have to help all of those people to come to a decision about what is the right route forward for the organization.
So the synthetic customer ultimately is the reaction point. They will react to what it is ultimately that we are putting out to market. Can you unpack that for us?
Yeah. So one of the things that we can do with these is rather than just having a static piece of paper, and I've seen far too many times where they've sort of ended up just rusting away on a hard drive or put in a drawer, never to be looked at again. We can actually query them and ask them questions both about how would you react to that. I've just been going through and updating a few pages on my website, and what I do as I go through that, I'm actually asking my persona that I've gone out and done research to capture the voice of customer and other bits of information about, how do I go through and make sure this is appealing to all of those different persona?
Right.
And one of the really interesting things was, the last update I did, it said you're under indexing for one of them. If you want to make sure you don't lose that persona, you need to make sure that you've got information here, here, and here. Is it perfect? Probably not. But it
Yeah.
means that you're able to keep a real focus on the customer and really being able to have that test bed before you go out to the market and, test in real life.
Where in the marketing funnel, I know the answer to this, but I've got to ask this question because it's important. Do you feel synthetic customers have the biggest impact?
Well, I think it's all the way through.
Exactly.
And
Yeah.
and the reason for that is that we really need to understand our customers better than ever before. AI is changing so many things. There's so much volatility and uncertainty in the world right now that we really have to help understand what's keeping our customers up at night. What jobs do they really need doing, and what jobs do they need us to help them with? So the research is absolutely critical here.
Yeah.
But then if we can make sure that we activate that research and then look at, well, how do we make sure that the brief is answering the customer needs? How do we make sure that the various bits of content are meeting the customer needs, that they're resonating with what we've heard from the customer? That can then help translate all the way through from, the very first sort of ideation phase all the way through. Now, I will caution, please don't think that you can just ask these to come up with a marketing strategy or anything and just think that that's good enough. Some of the early work I did here, I went away and I'd created persona, and so I used those as part of this sort of synthetic customer approach. And it came up with the four key pillars that I'd
Right.
identified for the strategy, but it didn't have any of the subtlety that, that then the human condition, the je ne sais quoi, as you will, that the human mind can come up with. So they're really good test beds. They're really good at making sure that we capture the language that they use, but there's still something that is the surprising, the unexpected that only humans can add.
I completely agree. And if you think about the trademark piece of this as well, AI is not trademarkable right now. So that final creative concept, the final messaging, it helps tremendously. There's no doubt about it. We use it day in and day out. But if you're really diving into something that does need to be trademarked, you've got to remember that. We talk a lot on the show about, crap in, crap out. And that's why the human element is so incredibly important here. Can you walk us through an example of how you and your team have developed a synthetic customer and executed it in practice?
Yeah, sure. So, I've been doing this a way, and what I will say is that the process has developed from originally just taking a fairly detailed persona document and then adding that into, creating a custom GPT. So that was back when, a couple of years ago when custom GPTs first were made possible. Now you can I've taken 30 odd voice of customer interviews, quantitative interviews, qualitative interviews over a time period, added on deep research into the questions that might be being asked, what people are saying about the category itself that the company's operating in. So, being able to see what questions do these people ask about this, this topic, and what brands come up in that, and really being able to pull together an insane amount of data that I would never be able to personally interrogate and hold together to be able to come up with an idea. But I can then build all of that and turn that into, using these reasoning models and a large number of tokens I'll add to be able to then create archetypes, but essentially sort of the different persona amongst those, and really being able to look at, okay, so these are then how we group those together. These are the personas that we have. How does that then, and then being able to turn those into essentially the context that we would use. Now you can either use those in a custom GPT or a Copilot agent. You can create those as a skill in Claude or as the context within a project. But you can also go and take that further. And I've been doing work where you turn that into a a retrieval augmented generative AI system that you host somewhere in the cloud and via an MCP server, anybody anywhere can, if they've got the credentials and, obviously security is important here, they can connect to that MCP server and access their persona from, remotely. And that's quite a nice way if you want to make sure that you've got control over versioning and things like that. So there's a whole range of ways that you can make them, but at the end of the day, it's basically creating a knowledge base that the AI is then using as a form of saying, this is who I want you to operate as.
Yeah. What is your go-to AI tech stack for this?
So I would say at the moment it's Claude. I've been using Claude for quite a while now, but I'm also using the likes of OpenAI. You find that the different models keep moving and changing, but it's really the connectors, the harnesses, if you will, that are making the big difference at the moment. And so being able to use large amounts of data on your, from your, files that are on your computer and being able to analyze those has been really, really powerful recently.
So just a minute ago, we talked about the fact that you're very, very clear that this is not a replacement for research. How should marketers think about the balance needed there?
So I like to think about, research budgets have always been tricky. People either have a lot of budget for research, or they don't have very much at all. So I always think you should learn as much about your customer as you possibly can. There's quite a lot you can do without actually having to go and physically talk to your customer, because you can now do a lot of social listening online anyway. And so you can get a pretty good approximation there.
Right.
But anything that you've got, the more in-depth voice of customer, the interviews, if you can go and do ethnography and really understand it, that's really where you get that last 15% of the real special sauce, where you really get the spicy insight that
Okay.
nobody else is going to capture. So if you're looking at something that's just going to be, is this going to work in my category? Maybe using deep research and sort of finding out what you can find out online is enough. But bear in mind that pretty much any of your competitors can do that anyway.
Yeah.
If you're then going to go off and capture voice of customer, this is where it becomes your unique insights that you can then really layer in and really use and take advantage of.
Yeah, that's great. Are there any situations where you feel a synthetic customer should not be used?
Yeah, so there's bits of information and research out there that sort of show that you really shouldn't use it too much for sort of pricing. And there's been experiments where
We all want it for nothing.
exactly. But there was an example where I think Claude, or they created an agent called Claudius to look at to manage a food kiosk, and it failed miserably. It managed the kiosk, but it made a staggering loss.
Yeah.
So I think we have to be careful around relying on these to make too many deep, fundamental decisions about things like pricing. But being able to, it also looks at what information have you captured. So if you've already done a pricing analysis and you've been out to customers and you've got lots of information, then AI can do a great job of synthesizing that and creating a model that will be able to answer those questions. But if you haven't captured that data, if you haven't asked those questions, then it's going to be inferring the answers. And that's where you get into trouble, because AI is really, really good at giving wrong answers very, very confidently. And so we have to be careful that we understand what's gone into these synthetic customers, so that we know what boundaries we really should be, feeling confident or not confident about trusting what they say. And I would always argue that no matter where you get to, it's always good to then have a check with real customers at the end of it. But hopefully whatever comes out when you go to real customers is much, much closer than you would have been without.
What is the biggest hurdle that you see marketers across the world experiencing when it comes to letting in-house salespeople and product people know about the synthetic customer and the intel that was gained? Is there bias? Is there, we're not going to use it? What do you hear?
But I think there's a bigger problem in terms of an AI problem an AI adoption problem, rather than a shall we say, a bias against a synthetic customer or not. In terms of, because I've certainly been doing a lot of work, with marketing teams, we're expanding that sort of laterally into product teams and into sales teams as well. So we've been expanding that. And I think that the trick with product is that you've really got to get really good insights. So it's a way of activating their insights to help them as part of the innovation process. And then, of course, those insights really carry powerfully into marketing. Of course, if a product's taken a couple of years to develop, you need to make sure that you're getting a tech checkpoint to see, well, how much has things changed since we developed the product before we go to marketing. And then I think with sales, the biggest challenge is that, do they really see their specific customer in that? So, the reactions are, well, is this just your US based persona, or is it, more local? And so again, it's looking at, and to be fair, a European buyer may be quite different to a US buyer. They're going to have certain things that correlate, but there's going to be certain other needs that are going to be very different because, the commercial landscape is different. So we have to be careful to look at where do these actually work? Where is the data consistent? And where do we need to then pivot to make sure that they're up to date?
Let's talk outcomes for a minute here. How quickly do you see teams really benefiting from synthetic customers?
Well, it's almost straight away. It's pretty much the same as once you start using a persona. So once you've created those persona, teams start using them straight away. Here, I think the difference is that you can start using them for far more tasks along that journey.
Right.
And you can start using them to stress test ideas, stress test outputs. Make sure that you've got those touch points all the way along. So I think it's a pretty much an instant. It's an instant benefit. Of course, the big challenge is that we still have a wide disparity of AI adoption between organizations that are very, very much, adopting AI everywhere, and some organizations that are still just scratching the surface there. So there is a big difference that's the biggest challenge, is really looking at, well, is AI for many people still just a somewhat sophisticated spell check?
Yeah. Trust is something that Avocet focuses on quite a bit. Our job is ultimately to create trust in the eye of the buyer. Are you seeing, and 65% of buyers don't trust who is marketing to them. It takes a lot of time to build that trust. Do you see synthetic customers helping the trust journey with customers?
I do. I think that there's a couple of ways that they can really help there. The first is that if customers see themselves represented within the marketing, they see them, they see their problems within the messaging, they see their needs being met, then that does help to improve trust. But of course, there is that brand, that corporate brand level of distrust that's, creeping across everywhere. But I think it becomes really important when you start looking at, if you start sort of reimagining the way that companies go to market and they do their marketing. If you start thinking about companies as publishing houses, and you start thinking of each of the individuals within there and building their personal brands, then those synthetic customers can help the individuals to go, to each, to go to, whether it's social media or to the emails that they write, and make sure that they're actually thinking about, okay, this is the switch we need to make to make sure we're speaking in the customer's language. And that's really where I think the trust really can help.
Yeah, I love that. It's so incredibly important. And we're closing in on our time today. I've got one final question for you. If you could test your final campaign against a version of your real buyer before it goes live, what would it catch that your internal team almost always misses?
Oh, it's a brilliant question, because I think it depends on what you've forgotten. But I think I'll come back to something that I just did recently. I mentioned earlier, I was updating some pages on the website, and I completely had, because I'd elevated the messaging to talk to certain personas, I'd under-indexed on others. And so all of a sudden it was making sure that I was being equitable about how I'm communicating across all of those personas. And so I think what it does is it really allows us to catch, are we prioritizing the right things? Are we making sure that we're being equal in the way that we speak to the buying group? Very often people ever forget about the needs of the procurement person within B2B. And yet, very often they have a big say at the table. Yet we often forget that we're actually marketing to them as well. So it's those sorts of things that are easy to forget that I think these really help us to catch, as well as really helping us to make sure that we've got the real insights and we're keeping those through each of those pieces of the process when we go from idea through to, execution, approval, and, distribution.
Well, I tell you, it's been a brilliant conversation today. So many incredible insights, Matt, and we really appreciate that. What is the best way for our audience to get in contact with you?
Well, they can visit me on the website at striven.com or email me at matt@striven.com, and that's STRIVENN.com. There's also a LinkedIn profile, and I'm sure that we'll be able to put the link in the show notes.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Matt. As you think about today's conversation, here is a real question. Who's actually in the room when your campaigns get built? Because the difference between marketing that feels good internally and marketing that performs in the market is whether the buyer ever left the process. At Avocet, we believe great marketing isn't more about activity, it is about impact. Thanks for listening to StrategyCast. We'll see you next time.
That's a wrap. Thanks for joining us on today's show. We hope your strategic brains are spinning with new ideas and bold inspiration that will elevate your strategies and marketing know-how.